Hello, welcome to Design Time. I'm Jackie Lacey, and I'm joined today with Sandy Schroeck. She's been here all week working with our Wedding Bliss and Special Events course, which has been a great success. We're really lucky to have Sandy for two reasons. Not only is she an incredible instructor, but she also happens to be the National Membership Coordinator for AAFD. Welcome, Sandy, and thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you.
We thought it'd be a good time for us to take advantage on dispelling some of the differences between some of the basing techniques and design techniques that we see people sometimes confuse or struggle with. Now, all of these can be found in the AAFD Guide to Floral Design, but we're going to talk a little bit about them and let you know some of the differences so that you can not only prepare yourself for certification and competition, but utilize this in your everyday design techniques, correct?
That's correct.
When we start to look at these, go through some of the basic basing techniques that people tend to get confused with, Sandy.
Well, as we start looking, very much the beginning kind of application of design is radial placement. So it's kind of the structure that we learned at first when we're designing. So all of the stems are coming into one point, and the radial placement is like the flowers are out at the numbers on the clock.
Now, do they all have to be into the same insertion and the same point, or just in the same general direction?
They would all have to meet down at the same point, but it's a visual point. So it's not the same point in the foam here, but as they're coming in, they would come into a point that would be in the middle of that. So that's that radial placement
Sure.
that comes into one point.
And this is important because, remember, you don't want to try to put too many points or insertions in the same area of the foam, because you can weaken it and suddenly it can break and destroy on you. So it's the same general or growing point. I know it's used across the world in some of the other testing sites and areas, but it's a general direction, so it's going to go in that point and cross at some point. What's the next thing that we're looking at?
So our next technique that we're looking at is actually pillowing. So pillowing is one that you think that's clouds. It's generally higher up in the middle and then forms that pillowing effect that comes down into the surface of your design container.
Now, I've heard a lot of people get this confused with paving. Paving and pillowing are distinctively different. Can you talk a little bit about what makes them different from each other?
Well, you can see we've put both techniques right next to each other. So the pillowing, you can see kind of the rolling application of the materials, and paving is a more level surface. So think of it like a pathway or a sidewalk, a visual pathway through your design, and it's more of a level surface. So it could be higher or lower. Pave could be up the same height as your pillowing, but in this instance we showed it on two different planes just so you can get that visual.
And it's easy to see that this definitely does look like the clouds. That's a great way to interpret it. Think of pillowing as a clouding effect, and also looking at paving as that pathway, because even if it's a rounded cone shape, it was very popular several years ago to pave your roses for bridal bouquets or for other things, all at the same level. So think of it that way. With the pillowing, it's at different levels, coming up higher in the center and then tapering. And with paving, all of the insertions are more at that same level. It's a great way to look at it. Thanks so much for that.
That's correct.
What's this next one that we're looking at?
So the next one we're looking at is grouping. And so grouping doesn't really classify as the stem placement as that it's a family of products that are together. So it'll be the same materials, like you're walking through the garden and there's a grouping of the same materials that's growing here. You walk a little further down the path, there's a grouping of the materials there. So it's not determined by the level, but more, or the stem placement, but more by the families that are defined together.
So that's more of a design application as opposed to a basing technique.
That's correct.
Could be, though, a basing technique if you're grouping the products together, but not necessarily paving. So that's one of the reasons we wanted to look at some of these, because they're easily confused from one to the other, and making sure that you understand the definition according to the AAFD Guide to Floral Design is one of those things you have to be concerned about when you're going through certification or competition. application. And then how about the next element?
Well, some involve definitely stem placement. So our next technique that we're looking at is parallel stem placement. So parallel stem placement would mean that the two floral materials do not meet at any point. So if you look at this, if you look down, those lines are going to form X's down below the visual pathway. Here on parallel stem placement, there's not any position that those lines would meet. Here we've shown it in a vertical, but parallel stem placement can also be on other lines. So you're able to go, a diagonal line could be parallel stem placement, as long as the two pieces of material would not have a point where they cross over and form an X.
So if we changed these and inserted them that way, do we still have parallel stem placement?
No, because when I look at this stem, if you look beyond, the visual pathway now has been interrupted, and each of those two stems a little bit further down are definitely going to cross. And so that does not indicate parallel stem placement then.
Great. So make sure that everything is going to be either vertical or horizontal on a plane, never intersecting, even through infinity.
Right. So
Very
yeah,
good.
you connect that stem all the way down beyond where you see it in the foam.
Perfect. And then what about this last one with the roses?
So here we're looking at terracing, and that's more of a stairway. So you can use the same element, and it would be stepping up and terracing. So terracing could be done with flat pieces too. Something like a sponge mushroom that you would come, and it would not be stair steps that come up in the same manner as stairs, but it could have one level here, one coming here, and here, but those materials stacked on each other in a pattern is going to be terracing.
Great. So really looking at the stair stepping effect, no matter how you're doing it, even here we start to see somewhat of a stair step is also a terracing effect or design application. Great way to look at that.
Yeah.
What about some of the foliages I see that you've got laying here? What are those for?
Well, we look at some of the basing techniques. So foliages could also be a pave type technique where you would just layer a couple pieces of foliage just right one over the other. Foliages could also be used as a sheltering effect, and this would be the sheltering technique where it's covering one surface over the other, giving that shelter to the floral materials below.
This is sort of going to qualify for some of that creative flair that we were talking about in the video we did the other day.
Yeah.
Great.
A lot of these techniques can all be found in the design application section of the book, and so it's really about kind of taking the products that you're giving, understanding stem placement, and then also the techniques of basing techniques, and then just how can we change the product a little bit. So something like foliage manipulation, you could use in basing techniques to cover. So here we've just taken a couple of the variegated aspidistra, and you can see that we've used them, and that could come in and you could layer some of those pieces on there. It would cover your mechanics and also just show some creativity. Here this week, one of the students showed me this, and so it's just taking that leaf and creating a much smaller surface. So rather than the large placement, I really get a lot of creativity brought in with just that leaf manipulation.
So now we sort of have taken a basing technique, we're using design application to create a basing technique and also adding creative flair. So a lot of things that we do in design are going to cross over and have multiple things that they can qualify for. Remember, when you're adding this in, it is also sort of a bit of terracing as we start to layer those products one on top of each other.
Yeah.
Make sure that if you understand them individually, then you can really understand better how to manipulate those.
Yeah.
One of the last ones that I know people constantly get confused are binding and banding. Binding and banding, both starting with B's, sort of throw us a little curve from time to time. But one easy way to remember them is that with Binding, you are binding something together. It's a mechanical technique that holds things together, like we've done here with the floral tape. We've also used this metal wire, metallic wire, to bind and band, because it is binding them together, but is also decorative, which is the other thing that banding differs from binding. When you're banding something, it can be on top of the mechanics. We've got some floral tape here. We could easily slide this down, maybe not so easily, to cover up the mechanics. So now our binding has been covered or dressed up, so to speak, with a professional finish with banding, and here we see both, binding and banding, or binding and banding with the same product.
Yeah.
It's something that can be left exposed. Don't be afraid to. Don't be afraid to use that for your mechanical application, so that you can leave it exposed and not have to cover something else up. Anything else we want to share right now?
Just make sure to take a look at the design application section of your book and understand the stem placements, and discover things on ways you can add creative flair into your design. Elevate those designs to really create that interest for your customers and for the evaluators.
And if you take a little section of the book as you're practicing for your certification and competition, or for your testing process, tackle it a little at a time. Be very familiar with what the technique is. Maybe record it, write it down. I know Sandy suggested that the other day. Have it placed on your station so that you can look at your finished products and apply those elements and principles, design techniques and basic techniques, and know the difference. That will allow you to have that creative edge and an upper edge of being a little more comfortable when you're in that testing process. Yeah. Thank you so much, Sandy, for being here and joining us. Thanks for being here this week. I appreciate it. I know the students loved it. And please join us again next time for Design Time. If you enjoyed that video
and want to see more, click the subscribe button.